Thank you for coming. This is a book presentation by Stephanie Malia Hom, a brilliant academic and nonprofit executive. She writes and lectures on modern Italy, and she's written a fabulous book on tourism called The Beautiful Country, Tourism and the Impossible State of Destination Italy. She's an expert on migration, detention, which is the subject of the book she's talking about today. And I have learned a ton from her about mobility studies. We edited a book together called Italian Mobilities, and she was really the driving force to expose me to this wonderful work from this kind of academic paradigm, this analytic paradigm, which is also present in the book where she's going to talk about today. So her new book, and this is the basis for her talk, is Empire's Mobius Strip, Historical Echoes in Italy's Crisis of Migration and Detention. So Stephanie will, she has a PowerPoint and a video, and you have, if you came in late, I don't know if you have lyrics, which were passed out. So she's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and I will just respond for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to really open it up to questions and comments from all of you. So, Stephanie.
Thank you, everyone, and many thanks to Ruth and the Department of Italian Studies and NYU for inviting me here today. It's such a pleasure to be able to share my research with you. So today I will be sharing an excerpt from my new book, Empire's Mobius Strip, Historical Echoes in Italy's Crisis of Migration and Detention. It's a book that begins from the premise that mobility has fast become the main stratifying factor of our time, and that there is a profound difference between those who move by choice and those who are moved by force. Those who move by choice, like tourists, understand modern Italy as a destination. It is a beautiful country, il bel paese, where pilgrims, grand tourists, and so many others have long traveled to gaze upon the ruins of ancient empire, to learn from the divine portions of Renaissance art and architecture, to marvel at the land's natural beauty, or more generally, to eat, pray, and love. Since the arrival of mass tourism to the peninsula in the mid-19th century, the notion of destination Italy has overshadowed that of Italy as a political nation-state. In fact, Italy only became unified as a nation-state in 1861, after a violent decades-long process known as the Risorgimento. The modern Italian nation-state has since been mired in discourses of belatedness, lack, and division, even to this day, despite the fact that its 150 years of existence would prove otherwise. My point is that Italy is better known today in the cultural imagination, broadly speaking, as a land of pizza, Prada, and la dolce vita, rather than by its weak and fragmented political affinities. And I explore all of this in my first book on tourism, The Beautiful Country, Tourism and the Impossible State of Destination Italy. In the course of researching my first book, however, I struggled to reconcile the romanticized touristic imaginary of Destination Italy with what I encountered on the ground, which included squalid nomad camps isolated along city peripheries, or public monuments built with taxpayer money, such as this one to honor a convicted war criminal like Rodolfo Graziani, or the general consensus across the Italian political spectrum to criminalize immigration and to militarize policy against all migrants, which plays out across the system of migrant detention centers that exist at the limits of both the state and the law. I was especially struck by the haunting images of thousands of would-be migrants rescued from shipwrecks along Italy's vast coastline, as well as their tragic stories of confinement, which we still see with all too much frequency in the news today. And I was surprised to learn that the most common routes of migration taken by these people from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe traverse Italy's former colonies, particularly Libya, and that men and women from these ex-colonial territories make up many of those who seek to enter Italy. And so this was the context in which I set out to write my second book, of which you will hear an excerpt today. Italian Empire, by conventional definition, was a short-lived affair. It lasted just 8 years, bookended by Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and the fall of the fascist regime in 1943. Its relative brevity, in part, has led to its omission from studies of modern European imperialisms, even though Italy's colonial projects in East Africa and Libya stood among the most brutal and bloody of the last century. Empire was anything but short-lived for the hundreds of thousands of Italians who carried out Italy's imperial ambitions, nor was it brief for the many people who became subjects of those ambitions and have since remained subjugated to that power decades after Italian Empire officially ended. Empire creates a ripple effect across time and space, and in the words of Anne Stoler, saturates the subsoil of people's lives and persists, sometimes subjacently, over a longer durée. The collective of ongoing ripple effects has been called imperial formations, that is, quote, polities of dislocation, processes of dispersion, appropriation, and displacement dependent upon moving categories and populations, and on material and discursive postponements and deferrals. These are uneasy, messy constellations always in the process of becoming and unraveling. Some imperial formations are more explicit than others. In the context of modern Italy, take the Via dei Fori Imperiali in Rome, for example. Built between 1924 and 1932, this street physically and symbolically linked the foremost sign of Italy's ancient empire, the Roman Colosseum, with the nerve center of its new fascist empire, Piazza Venezia. Mussolini ordered the demolition of one of Rome's most densely populated neighborhoods to make way for this imperial artery, evicting and displacing thousands of residents, appropriating their homes, bulldozing churches, razing gardens, demolishing medieval and Renaissance structures, and destroying untold numbers of archaeological ruins, the debris of the Roman Empire. The road still stands, and each day thousands of tourists shamble along this vector of Italy's empires, appropriating the space anew. The Via dei Fori Imperiali is a clear example of an imperial formation materialized in brick and cobblestone. Its existence is owed to a discrete constellation of dispersion, dislocation, and displacement that arose at a particular historical moment in a particular cultural context, fascist Italy. In fact, it was at the terminus of this road, from the balcony of a palazzo in Piazza Venezia, that Mussolini famously issued his proclamation of Italian Empire on May 9th, 1936. Italy finally has its empire after 15 centuries, the reappearance of empire on the fated hills of Rome. Concretized in roadwork and by rhetoric, Italy's new fascist empire symbolically and physically appropriated the empire of ancient Rome along the Via dei Fori Imperiali. Other imperial formations are harder to pinpoint. Sometimes they require adjusting one's critical lens to recognize deeper, subtler constellations that arise over time. For example, take the controversial Nomad Emergency Decree issued in 2008 by then Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi's government. This decree pronounced nomads a threat to public order and security, by which it meant the Roma specifically, who are pejoratively known as gypsies. By declaring a state of nomad emergency, the decree empowered municipalities like Rome, Naples, and Milan to intervene with force. Bulldozers and excavators arrived with little notice at the entrances of Romani settlements known as campi nomadi, nomad camps, and quickly set to work about demolishing them. When the bulldozers were finished, all that remained of these communities were crumpled walls and scattered 2x4s. Thousands of Roma were displaced and dispossessed in the process. This act of forced dislocation has a name in Italian, sgombero. It's roughly translated as eviction, but connotations of evacuation, clearing, vacating, and loss are also bound up in the meaning of the word. The Roma who lost their homes by sgombero either relocated to other camps or were sequestered in government-built villages scattered along the urban periphery. Yet the Roma were not the first nomads who presented a threat to the Italian state. Italian colonial officials considered il grande nomadismo, the great nomadism of Bedouin in tribes in Libya, a clear and present danger, so much so they declared a state of emergency against them in 1930. This nomad emergency decree paved the way for the forced dispossession and displacement of more than 100,000 Bedouin from their homelands. Not only that, the decree also provided the juridical pretense for imprisoning them in Italian-built concentration camps along the desolate Cyrenaican coast. Nomadism was thought to be so threatening that it could be only countered by immobilization. The squalid conditions of these camps made for deathly living among the barbed wire, frayed tents, famine, intractable diseases, and endless dust and wind. In the span of just 4 years, 1929 to 1933, at least 40,000 Bedouin died in these Italian-built concentration camps. Some historians put the death toll closer to 70,000. It was a genocide that remains little known outside of Libya today. If mentioned at all, the camps are but footnotes in studies of European imperialisms. More often than not, they are simply absent, unknown, and long repressed by the myth of Italians as good colonizers, or brava gente. When we open out our analytic frame, the bonds between what were once seen as distinct constellations come into focus. In this example, the nomad emergencies that manifested almost a century apart are connected by the logics and practices rooted in Italy's imperial ambitions. The one finds direct resonance in the other. They signal the surfacing of an imperial formation, all of its messy, uneasy, violent becoming and unraveling. The camps linked to nomadism are hardly imperial debris, but rather live sites of this formation as it stretches out across time and folds back on itself. Empire's Mobius Strip. The camp. The Omega, Ponte Galleria, CIE, Center of Identification and Expulsion. The outskirts of Rome have the feel of an urban wasteland. Empty streets decossate the landscape, skeletal apartment blocks stand half-finished, abandoned parking lots languish in various states of overgrowth and decay. In the summer, the area feels more apocalyptic than usual because of the heat. It radiates from the asphalt and pools around the body as if from a circle of Dante's Inferno. No one walks these streets. In the midst of all this, the Centro di Identificazione ed Espulsione, Center for Identification and Expulsion, at Ponte Galleria, hides in plain sight. Its concrete walls and metal fences seem little out of place. This is Italy's largest migrant detention center and often the last stop for illegal immigrants before they are forced out of the country. It was here that I met a young Nigerian woman named A during my second field visit in March 2013. She stood in the middle of the room, nude. She was still wet from the shower, her body glistening in the dappled light of the newspapers affixed to the windows as makeshift curtains. She was proud of her figure and rubbed lotion vigorously on her arms, legs, and breasts, seemingly unashamed of her nudity as she stood before me, a stranger from the outside. As her hands moved rhythmically, she talked to me. Rather, A did not just talk. It would be more accurate to say that with every sentence, she issued a proclamation. She proclaimed that being detained in Bologna was better than being here in Rome. She proclaimed what she missed about Africa. She proclaimed that her breasts were beautiful. She proclaimed that she had a boyfriend on the outside who would take care of her if only she was set free. Her most vehement proclamations were reserved for the center itself. In Italy, life is not free, she said. This is not a prison, this is a camp. A camp is very different from a prison. Just as A sensed implicitly, many scholars have noted that the migrant detention centers of the 21st century are the grim heirs to the concentration camps of the 20th. The camp is not just a space, according to Giorgio Agamben, but the instantiation of the biopolitics that define modernity. The camp is a spatial practice. It makes real the state of exception that has now become the rule. It materializes the logic of sovereignty. It exists between the temporary and the permanent. And to go one step further, the camp normalizes exception and its corollary emergency in such a way that it inverts sociality to promote unbonding as a form of relation. It is this via negativa of disconnection, disengagement, uncommitment, and disorder that defines the camp, and according to Agamben, that which gives order to our contemporary space and time. Illegal immigrants experience this unbonding today in sites like Ponte Galleria. In Italy, they have even nicknamed these centers lager. The state of exception, the perceived threat of a mobility crisis, and the containment of a mobile populace within the neatly ordered yet oppressive space of Ponte Galleria are all haunting reminders of Italy's colonial past not so long ago. In Italian colonial Libya, the Bedouin, rather than illegal immigrants, occupied the role of dangerous mobile other. Their resistance to Italian occupation and purported grande nomadismo gave rise to the most brutal of colonial policies and military actions. I situate Agamben's foundational theories of the camp within the cultural context in which he was writing, that is, among the pronounced disavowal of Italy's colonial experience. Agamben ties the emergence of the camp, in Auschwitz specifically, to the ultimate figure of exception under Roman law, the homo sacer, sacred or accursed man. The Libyan camps provide a different angle on Agamben's formulation. They are always already imbricated within empire's Mobius Strip in that they were modeled in part on the Roman castrum, that is, the camp of the Roman legion. They not only spatialized a state of exception vis-a-vis the figure of the homo sacer, but also recouped a moving threshold of empire, the castrum, in space. Spaces of limbo. I missed that slide. Ponte Galleria is surprisingly easy to access because vectors of mobility surround it. A highway, a railroad, even an airport. Each day, thousands of passengers, either en route to Fiumicino Airport or Rome's Central Train Station, pass by the center. Most are totally unaware of its existence. The hypermobility of these travelers is a stark contrast to the coerced immobility of those detained within the center. Their ability to move is authorized by the Italian state vis-a-vis passports and border controls, whereas those in the center suffer the consequences for exercising the wrong type of mobility. Inside, the male and female sectors are almost mirror image of one another and flank opposite sides of a central administrative building. Each has a separate cafeteria, bunkhouses, open concrete yards. I made subtle note of the differences during my visit, like the clear plexiglass panels mounted atop the fences in the men's sector to deter escapes, and that the men appeared more heavily guarded than the women. A two-way mirror allowed for carabinieri to monitor anyone entering and exiting the men's sector, while this was absent from the women's. This is the men's sector here. Otherwise, the barred windows and ascetic bunkhouses all looked exactly the same. It looked and felt like a prison. Men and women remained segregated at Ponte Galleria, but were free to move about their respective sectors throughout the day. However, they were locked into the bunkhouses at night. Ironically, they are called ospiti, or guests. One social worker told me that ospiti didn't circulate much because ethnic groups usually kept to themselves in self-imposed seclusion. Each dormitory block housed 4 to 6 women who shared an open shower and a Turkish toilet. Makeshift murals decorated the walls. At the entrance of one room, someone had drawn a large cat with glowing green eyes. Another mural showed a bird in a colorful basket of flowers. I found the bunkhouse room to be warm and stuffy. A new electric heater pumped hot air throughout. Magazine and newspaper pages, brittle and yellowing with age, were pasted on the windows to keep out the nighttime floodlights. I talked with several Nigerian women who occupied the room. We talked over the white noise of TV soap operas and B-movies dubbed into Italian. No one was watching them. Each ospite had her own bed, outfitted in the center's ubiquitous green tissue paper-like sheets that had been creatively transformed elsewhere around the center into clotheslines, shoelaces, washcloths, and even a hammock. Dressers held hygienic products, as well as stockpiles of packaged chips, brioches, and juice boxes, purchased from the center's storehouse with the weekly allowance. The women told me about their recent transfer from the detention center in Bologna. They complained of the food, pre-packaged microwavable meals provided by an outside catering company, as well as the beds, toilets, laundry, and life in general. One woman had apparently lost her voice from yelling the night before. She claimed to have had a medical emergency while locked in the bunkhouse and tried to signal the guards to no avail. The social worker was skeptical, saying that there was always someone on duty, and if that person didn't hear their calls, she should have tried banging on something on the bars. "But what do we have to bang?" asked another one of the ospite defiantly, looking around to the chips, brioches, and juice boxes. "We have nothing." The physical immobility experienced by the ospiti in the center was offset by the communicative mobility made possible by cell phones. Many of the detainees carried mobile phones, but without video or camera functions, that are used to call relatives, friends, and lawyers on the outside. The phones are integral to the delicate navigation of the complex bureaucracy involved in identification and expulsion. They are crucial for strategizing one's release. In a space that seems so far apart from the digitally augmented urbanism that characterizes much of contemporary Europe, the cell phone emerges as a poignant means of emancipation at Ponte Galleria. It is an instrument of communicative mobility that helps one break free from physical immobilization. It wasn't immobility, but rather boredom that seemed to demoralize everyone I spoke with at Ponte Galleria. Mealtimes and visits to the magazzino broke up the day's lassitude. Many lingered in courtyards or at the cafeteria after lunch or made small talk with employees at the storeroom. Some ospiti spoke of being deprived intellectually because they were not allowed to have paper or books or anything flammable for that matter, so that reading and writing were out of the question. There was also a makeshift hair salon for the female ospiti, which was an important social space for the women there, a space of femininity par excellence. There were 2 sinks for washing hair, a set of 3 mirrors and plastic chairs, and a pink dresser. There was also a shower in one corner of the salon, where women could shave their legs under supervision. Razors were attentively distributed and recollected. Here, women carefully crafted their hair and bodies to the standards of beauty dictated by the impeccably coiffed blonde woman with porcelain skin staring out from a poster overlooking the salon. Her platinum hair had been ironed straight and her violet eyes accentuated with mascara. The women at Ponte Galleria looked nothing like her. They had dark skin, crow's feet, over-processed hair, innumerable scars, both visible and unseen. As sex workers, many of them once offered up their beauty and their bodies in exchange for pay. Some forewent condoms to pocket extra cash. Their young lives centered on having sex for money. As a result, many of these women contracted diseases, and social workers had to explain not only the bureaucracy of political limbo, but also the biological facts of medical diagnoses. At Ponte Galleria, bodies were framed in medical jargon and personhood in legal codes. A's body was probed by state-sanctioned medical doctors, her mind assessed by staff psychologists, her movements controlled by police and carabinieri, her legal status as subjects debated by public defenders, consular officials, and court magistrates. Whereas a prisoner's status under the law is relatively clear, everything about the ospite is ambiguous at Ponte Galleria. She exists between state power and statelessness. Personhood is continually redefined by parallel and paradoxical legal and medical grammars. She feels caught up in a biopolitical machine, caught between human and inhuman. This is what A meant when she proclaimed, "This is a prison. This is not a prison. This is a camp." The Alpha, colonial concentration camps. If Ponte Galleria is the omega of the camp in contemporary Italy, we can find its predecessor, the Alpha, on the bowed dry plains of eastern Libya almost 90 years ago. It was here that the Italian colonial administration ordered the construction of 16 concentration camps between 1929 and 1933, almost all of which were located within a 200-kilometer radius of the region's capital, Benghazi. Historians estimate some 100,000 people, or 2/3 of Cyrenaica's mostly Bedouin population, were imprisoned here, and in the span of just 4 years, untold numbers of them died. At least 40,000 people died in the camps proper, with Libyan historians placing the death toll even higher, between 50 and 70,000. At Soluk, the largest of the camps. Some 5,000 people alone died in its first year of operation. Many died from disease and starvation. Others died on the forced marches across the desert, pushed against their will into the sedentary life of the camp. Still others were executed by Italian troops, usually shot or hanged both in and outside the camps. Altogether, it was a protracted genocide that, again, remains little known outside Libya today. Like today's illegal immigrants, it was the Bedouins' mobility that proved to be their greatest threat. The archival record shows that much of Italian military policy in Libya was designed in response to il grande nomadismo, the grande nomadismo of indigenous tribes. Symbolically, the nomad became the quintessential figure whose movements were considered dangerous in Italian colonial Libya, and for whom concentration camps were built to contain. Ruth Ben-Ghiat explains, quote, "As a metaphor for mobility, the nomad conjured all that fascism feared: uncontrolled movement, ephemerality, and the absence of national or territorial loyalties." General Rodolfo Graziani described the nomad problem in his noted 1932 work, Cyrenaica Pacified. He writes, "Wayward from every constraint of discipline, accustomed to moving freely in often immense and desert territories, powerful in their mobility and facility of movement, pervaded by the allure of independence, always ready for war and for plunder, the nomads have always reacted to every government constraint." For Graziani, nomads were enemies of the state. Anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard confirmed this sentiment in his classic 1949 ethnography about the Senussi of Cyrenaica. Quote, "The Italians detested the Bedouin. In the whole of Italian literature on Cyrenaica, I have not read one sentence of understanding of Romani values. Because they lived in tents without most of the goods the peasant, and even more the townsman, regard as signs of civilization, the Italians spoke of them as barbarians, little better than beasts, and treated them accordingly." To counter the dangerous mobility of the Bedouin, Italian colonial officials, led by Graziani, invoked its converse, immobilization. They forcibly marched and resettled most of Cyrenaica's Bedouin population into concentration camps between 1929 and 1933. They shut down zawiyas and confiscated Senussi estates and properties. They cut off supplies and reinforcements to mobile guerrilla bands. They cemented up or guarded the few wells in the region. They closed the frontier and ordered the construction of a 270-kilometer-long barbed wire fence along the Libya-Egypt border in 1931 to stave flows of rebel contraband. Sedentarization and the stoppage of movement of people, goods, and weapons and ideas proved to be the orders of the day. In a rare series of photographs housed in the Archivio Centrale dello Stato in Rome, a group of tattered men, women, and children wait for food in the chalky sands of Marsa el Brega. The sky is cloudless and the sun high enough to erase all shadows. Several people hold hands to their faces, either shielding themselves from the sun or gripping their heads in despair or both. Another photo reveals a claustrophobic panorama of tightly packed tents, low-slung and battered, stretching far into the horizon. Still another shows a small group of men in new burnouses, faces weathered and weary, unwillingly posed for a photograph. Unlike Auschwitz, where genocide took form in brick and mortar, the Libyan camps were meant to be temporary spaces. They were meant to exist only for 2 years at most, but instead stood for almost 5. From the air, the camps gave the impression of a neat, controlled, and productive colonial order. A certain transparency permeated the camp's barbed wire perimeters and woolen tents, lending a sense of violation to everything. Prisoners were not kept behind concrete walls, but instead could stare freely into the desert just beyond their reach. The camps expressed the Italian state's absolute control over a subjugated populace and space, but they did so with temporary, quasi-porous structures, tents and barbed wire, rather than the architectural forms of dominance typically associated with Italian colonial rule in Libya. Absent were the monumental buildings and Italianization of autochthonous forms, the common spatial exercise of Italian state power in the colonies. The camps also took the form of an ancient Roman castrum, a temporary defensive military encampment used by the Roman legion. The Libyan camps were laid out in almost exactly the same way. Bordered by a 1,200-meter-long quadrilateral perimeter, the camps, these 20th century castra, contained within them smaller squares that housed 15 to 20 linear rows of tents. There were also spaces allocated for daily assemblies, food and clothing distribution, exercise displays, and most horrifically, public executions. The camps then gave the impression of being a spatial order that housed an absolutely subjugated populace engaged in a productive colonialism. The system of Libyan camps was ostensibly the brainchild of Pietro Badoglio, who became the governor of Libya in 1929 and who had created the camps with the knowledge that they would decimate the local population. In correspondence to Graziani, Badoglio wrote sinisterly, and I don't have this on the quote, he wrote, "We must first create a broad and well-defined territorial separation between rebel forces and subdued population. I do not deny the extent and severity of this measure, which will mean the ruin of the subjugated population. La rovina della popolazione sottomessa," the exact quote. Other Italian colonizers, like General Emilio Canevari, believed these camps to be beneficent institutions. Many like him, actually I missed a couple of slides. This is an execution happening. It's an aerial view from an unnamed camp. This is from a series of photographs I found in the Central State Archives. And this was that quote I just read. General Emilio Canevari, many like him, he believed these camps to be beneficent institutions. Many like him completely disavowed the miserable existence of the people in the camps so as to reinforce the myth of Italians as good colonizers. In his memoir of the war, he writes, "We did not create concentration camps in Cyrenaica, but only some reserves and camps that were splendidly arranged and equipped with all the necessities, from tents of new camel wool to hygienic installations to water services, etc." Likewise, colonial propaganda painted an idyllic picture of the camps. For example, in April 1931, a news report in the colonial magazine L'Oltremare declared the camp at Soluk to be a type of locus amenis that boasted ordine e disciplina perfetta, order and perfect discipline, where regna ovunque l'igiene e la pulizia, where hygiene and cleanliness reign everywhere. His Excellency Amadeo Duca delle Puglie also visited the camps in 1931 and remarked to Graziani how lucky the detainees were for this new life of honest work, tranquility, and peace in the camps. Of course, these remarks entirely contradicted the experiences of the Bedouin actually imprisoned there. Their experience of the camps refuted the propagandistic ideas of the camps as splendidly outfitted reserves and paradises of order and perfect discipline. A remarkable series of oral histories compiled by the Libyan Studies Center in Tripoli have laid bare the brutal conditions of life in the camps. One particularly moving account was that of poet Rajab Hamad Bouash al-Minifi, who survived the camp at El Aguila. "I have no illness except this endless aging, loss of sense and dignity, and the loss of good people who were my treasure. I have no illness except being imprisoned by scoundrels and the lack of a cohort to complain to when wronged, the lack of those who rule with fairness, evenness non-existent, evil leaning on good, dominant." What then is the inheritance of the camp? The ospiti at Ponte Galleria are the new Bedouin in a cage. Their unsanctioned mobilities are, in fact, what led to their very immobilization in today's camp. They crossed borders without passports, they lived without papers, they existed in the shadows of the law. Once detained at Ponte Galleria, many ospiti rebel against the limbo of temporary permanence. Revolts are frequent and tend to turn violent. Just 1 month before my field visit in March of 2013, there was a particularly intense rebellion that began with an assault on a carabinieri and ended with an inferno of burning mattresses. At other times, ospiti turn the rebellion inward on themselves, for example, going on hunger strikes to protest their lives in this place known as Italian Guantanamo. Sometimes dissent has been taken to harrowing extremes, as in December 2013, when a group of 9 men sewed their mouths shut. It was equal parts hunger strike and symbolic action, to forcibly silence themselves as a way to be heard. The ospiti claimed they were taking a stand against the 18-month maximum period of detention, which was far longer than the standard 60 days prescribed by the EU. Their actions recalled an infamous episode in Amaro Lehus's 2006 best-selling novel, Scontro di civiltà per un ascensore a Piazza Vittorio, arguably one of the most famous works of Italophone literature to date, in which one character, Parviz, an Iranian immigrant, sewed his mouth shut after authorities refused to grant him a permit of stay. Over the course of 2014, there were 3 successive occurrences of bocche cucite, sewn mouths, at Ponte Galleria, and the extreme protests eventually garnered the attention of Italian lawmakers. To a certain degree, the bocche cucite succeeded in their goal. In November 2014, the Italian parliament passed a law that lowered the maximum stay of detention from 18 months to 60 days. At least 2 of the men, however, had already been expulsed from Italy. Successes like this are rare. More often, protests against immobilization in the center are answered by expanding the very structures of immobility. The primary result of both violent and nonviolent protests at Ponte Galleria was the creation of more severe architectures and practices of detention, including the erection of anti-escape panels atop the fences, the renovation of entryways for increased security, the installation of electronic locks and additional security cameras, and of course, the infamous ban on shoes in 2010. Detainees can only wear flip-flops or shoes without laces. The logic behind the shoe ban, which came into effect after a series of riots and successful escapes, was that ospiti, even if they did escape, could not get very far with bare feet. Thus, the shoe ban, the plexiglass panels, the computerized locks, and all so forth, all aim to fix ospiti further into the limbo of the CIE. Immobilization was the punitive countermeasure to their unsanctioned mobilities. What happens then when ospiti are released from Ponte Galleria? What happens when their lives on the inside of outside move beyond the walls of the center and back into the world at large? And more broadly, what kind of life comes after the experience of the camp? For many of the Bedouin who survived the concentration camps in Italian colonial Libya, life, now irreparably scarred by colonial violence, touched down in the built form of the village. The fates of those who passed through Ponte Galleria are lesser known, as many ospiti choose to go underground and remain in Italy in open violation of the expulsion decrees issued to them upon release. Some live in fear of discovery and deportation, others choose to speak out. They are the survivors of Ponte Galleria. One man who chooses words over silence is Abdel Karim Islam. Karim was arrested near his home in Milan and taken 600 kilometers south to Ponte Galleria. He has lived in Italy since 1995 and speaks Italian fluently with a hint of a Milanese accent. In the 2014 film Limbo, Karim explains that he legally resided in the country for many years until the death of his father. That death prompted him to go off the rails. He had to enter rehab, after which his permit of stay was not renewed. The bureaucratic machine of Ponte Galleria began its work of cementing Karim into the category of illegal immigrant and ordered his deportation to Egypt. He replied in consternation, "I'm more Italian than Egyptian. I don't have a house there in Egypt. I don't have anything there. Where do I go? I don't understand." According to Karim, the authorities tried to trick him into going to the airport, but he went crazy and they relented. He was eventually released and returned to Milan. An avid devotee of Italian hip-hop, Karim wrote a song in 2014 about his experience in Ponte Galleria called Tutto Tace. Its driving beats and convulsive lyrics prove stirring counterpoints to the silence embodied by the bocche cucite. Karim's song also taps into what have long been the traditional concerns of Italian hip-hop: marginalization, identity, inequality, and the feeling of living on the inside of outside. Whereas this was once the musical territory of Southern Italians speaking back against the discrimination and prejudice levied against them in their own country, it is now the purview of people like Karim, who refuse the category of illegal immigrant and use music to speak back against the power of the Italian state. Abdel Karim Islam refused to die in a cage, and it is only appropriate that I leave the last words to him. And we are going to go to this.
Da tempo, la maggior parte degli sbirri continua a puntarmi il dito, a trattarmi da clandestino. Dopo avermi tolto il permesso di soggiorno, un brutto giorno hanno spaccato in due il mio mondo, cambiando le date del mio ingresso in Italia, girando le carte in tavola. Uso le rime per raccontarvi una disavventura che mi hanno fatto vivere. Com'è possibile che un intero stato si sia sbagliato sulle mie informazioni base, sulla mia vera identità? È un ventennio che vivo in questa nazione. Loro dichiarano che sono entrato nel 2007 col gommone.
Silenzio quando mille paure dentro e non va bene niente anche se non mi lamento.
Credo che in questo buio presto ci salverà solo il talento. Non è un film che vedi la sera al cinema, questo è il film che parla della mia vita vera in una delle peggiori galere, la mia battaglia a Ponte Galleria. Essere libero come un gabbiano quando i ferri alla mano, ostaggio dello Stato che mi costringono a dare l'addio a casa mia a Milano, a volare verso la città del Vaticano, tanto bella che mai pensavo di trovarci un posto così disumano come il CIE, un muro di inganni e bugie. Che brutto quando ripenso al primo giorno dentro in gabbia insieme ad altre migliaia di razze perse e disperse come me, accecate dalla rabbia. Persone oneste rinchiusi con le peggiori teste, e meno male che la legge è per tutti uguale. Solo ora mi accorgo che è un'enorme cazzata scritta in tribunale.
Vivo nel silenzio quando mille paure dentro e non va bene niente anche se non mi lamento.
Credo che in questo buio presto ci salverà solo il talento. Carabinieri, finanzieri con i cani, militari armati, noi sempre sotto sorvegliati. Sembrava di stare in Siria o Baghdad e mai me lo scordo. Quel giorno all'aeroporto con inganno hanno tentato di farmi prendere un volo senza ritorno, a cui ho preferito lo scontro, giurando che sarei partito solo morto. Non sono pronto a lasciare tutto di colpo, tornare al paese di origine non esiste, sarebbe come sradicare una quercia dalle radici. Qui ho donna, famiglia, amici, non ci sono rimedi quando gli sbirri fanno i prepotenti e sono i primi a non rispettare la legge. Chi sistemerà questo sistema? Io non credo alle cazzate della Lega. Qui ognuno pensa a sé, se ne frega. Mentre scrivo ste pagine la mente riflette al cuore brutte immagini, verità crude nascoste dietro quelle mura. Io contro tutti e non ho paura. Come ho fatto ad arrivare a tanto? Ho bisogno di un ultimo slancio. Questa non può essere la mia fine. Fammi uscire.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm full of admiration for the book, and I'm just going to talk for a very brief time about why that is. And I think it intervenes on so many levels. And first is what it says about history. And, you know, it goes over 100 years, and it's one of its most valuable things is the historical connections that it draws between things happening in the 21st century and giving them, you know, tracing out genealogies that we may not think about, such as the Nomad Emergency Decree, connecting it to what happened in the Libyan desert in 1930-31. And mobile peoples for 100 years have been the category that's often persecuted, from wandering Jews to nomads to Roma people. And so this is, Stephanie's book shows us part of this kind of genealogy of persecution that has transcended space and time and is really a global thing. And we all know history at times of rising autocracy, like today also, we're in another wave of authoritarian rulers coming up, and history becomes revised. It becomes something that's on the front lines of in the war to protect democracy. Right now, if you mention the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in Putin's Russia, you will be breaking the law. If you mention Tiananmen Square in China, bad things will happen to you. And so Stephanie's book does not let people get away. In Italy, for example, who would like to say, quote, Mussolini never killed anyone, such as Berlusconi, that was one of his lines, or Ponza, which was just a place that, you know, Mussolini sent people in villeggiatura. He sent them on vacation there. So starting from the beautiful cover image where you have Ponza, but it's not a Ponza that we recognize. We think of Ponza, we think of the beach. We think of the, you know, the place we go on vacation. And here we have a beautiful classical interior, but we have a Libyan deportee. And so what this book does so well is put things together that we don't normally think of. We don't think of Ponza and Libyans. So she disrupts our kind of mental habits that come from past writings of history, which need to be expanded. So that's one of the things I like so much about this book. She also is, of course, intervening about empire, talking about empire and showing the connections between colonialism and neoliberal projects of domination. And one element that of today's right that we don't talk about enough is the fear that has come from the end of empire, post-decolonization, which has been over for years. But what empire did was allow states to control the movement of non-white bodies. And this fear is not only palpable in places like France and Britain that had a way to control those bodies for centuries, but of course in Italy too, and now in Hungary, everywhere. So who is going to control those bodies now? There is no more imperial power to do it. And so the kind of history that she traces shows this up very nicely. We see the after lives of imperial formations and the ruins of people and cultures that they continue to cause. And Italy, you know, had this Mediterranean vocation, this neo-colonial Mediterranean vocation, long after fascism ended, and is always interrogating what is its geographic place today, and in particular, what's its relationship with Libya, right? So you had the friendship pact between Gaddafi and Berlusconi, which was also had migrants at its center, and Meysam is here, and she's writing her dissertation on this. So the book shows how these fears, these obscure fears, become state policy in very different political contexts. And so that's my third point, is that she takes us on a journey that runs through dictatorship and democracy. And it's really important to do this today because we're living in a time where you have these new authoritarian states that have a semblance of democracy. And there are these continuities and persecution. So when authoritarians come to power, it can be in a putative democracy, and the pioneer here was Berlusconi. With his migrant camps and many other things, he was really the pioneer of things going on that are happening today. And it's an opportunity for us who live in democracies to see our history differently, to realize that perhaps things weren't as democratic as we thought. Perhaps there was another strand. Now in Italy, it's obvious. You had Mussolini. In other countries, such as our own, perhaps, today, it's not quite as clear. So methodologically, what Stephanie's doing is really important to do today. So her study in general is designed to make us rethink what we believe we know. And it's about the tensions between home and homelessness, incarceration and movement, because one of the things that you learn when you study, for example, prisoners of war, which I'll be doing a book eventually on it, is that these people were moved around constantly. And the more I learn about the institution of confino, the confinement under fascism, there were people who were moved to 15 different locations. So there's a lot of movement within confinement. And in Italy, these things are very important, both because it's the home, as you all know, of the original fascist state, the template for everything that's going on 100 years after, and also home of the biggest outflow of bodies, the biggest emigration, one of the biggest in world history. So she's trying to make us stop and think about things more carefully. And the subtitles she uses in her chapters throughout the book, one of them is Italian Guantanamo. Another is the inside of outside. And they shift our common conceptual frameworks, and they also point up paradoxes. And the biggest paradox is she talks about the centers for temporary permanence. In Italian, it's I centri di permanenza temporanea, which when I first saw this, I was reading an early piece of Stephanie's, I had to stop, and I said, what the heck is permanent, what is it, temporary permanence? But this is, of course, the essence of the state that she's describing, the kind of homelessness and the feeling of being thrown outside of society and also outside of productive time, right? And they're both, of course, designed to produce abjection and hopelessness, and lack of rebellion. So the last is style, and Stephanie's really lucid and accessible writing is a model for everybody. And she manages to bring us into these places, which she also did through visuals here. She recreates not only the physical topography, but the emotional topography. And she has a real eye for detail, and this comes from her training as a journalist. Stephanie worked as a journalist, as well as her ethnographic approach. So it's really very effective. So she gives voices and faces to refugees throughout time, and her prose is infused with what authoritarians past and present fear the most, solidarity and humanity for those who suffer. So I will stop there, and I think we'll just open it up to questions from you, comments, and please, there's quite a number of people here, so please make your questions concise, and hopefully they are more questions than just monologues. So we will take some. Do you want to take questions? Yeah.
I always think of the Star Wars movie, The Empire Strikes Back, and in a way it's kind of the vendetta of the people who were colonized going back to Italy. But my question is, in the 30s in Libya, when the conditions in these camps were so terrible and disease was rampant, didn't the Italian soldiers guarding these people get the disease and get sick also?
That's a very good question. I think for the most part, those Italian soldiers were separate. There's a piece in here where it wasn't actually Italians guarding a lot of these camps. They were Eritrean askari, right? So they were colonial subjects conscripted into the Italian army, guarding another set of colonized subjects. And so the notion of empire, right? That I was really interested in exploring this notion of empire because to me it represents the power over people. Right? The way that one populace subjugates another populace. And I saw the control of mobility as being central to that. When you control the movement of people, that's the way you control the population. And so in these camps, you have different populaces that are being controlled. So for one, Bedouin within the camps, but also the Askaris who are guarding them. And later in the third essay of the book, when I talk about the form of the village, where a lot of the survivors from the camps went afterwards, that too was, it was during the Ventimila, which was the big movement of Italian colonists to Cyrenaica. And these survivors of the camps were forced to build a lot of the villages for these incoming colonists. But those incoming colonists themselves were colonial subjects, Italian colonial subjects of the colonial administration. So you have, this intermixing of subjugation and power, subjugation in gradated forms is what I would say. Yes. Yes. Hi.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Really, I've read some bits of it, but so interesting. I was especially fascinated by the distinction, between camp and prison, which even the inmate herself is aware somehow, right? And she maybe is saying this is not a prison, so as to distinguish herself, to say I'm no criminal. I assume, yes, that was behind her.
I think somewhat.
Yeah.
I think it was the more existential feeling.
Yeah. It made me remember something which I've always wondered about, if it was just a kind of theoretical hypothesis or something that was in practice, which Hannah Arendt writes in the Totalitarianism book, that it was sometimes better to commit, let's say, a small crime and be an actual prisoner than, she's talking about the mid-20th century camps, than to be stateless and without definition. I have never read the entire book. It doesn't, I don't think it has cases on that. I don't know, maybe it does. But is this something that's actually true in practice? Is this something that, that is, or is this just a kind of exercise in thought?
No, it's absolutely true in practice. And I just have to say that I teased this out in the next essay, the essay on the village, in which I actually, your work on Cinecittà and the camp is, really forms part of that basis. But what I found looking at these camps, and I was wondering what comes after it, but it's this form of the village. And the village is, what I say in the book, is the space in which the Italian state harnesses inscriptions of race, ethnicity, and nationality to put its stamp on subjects. And that stamp is either the recognition or the refusal of citizenship, right? So in this very perverse way, and I outline this in the third essay, there's a scene in a movie, a documentary called Container 158, which was produced by Zalab in Rome. It's a fantastic movie about these villaggi attrezzati, which are government-built trailer parks or equipped villages, right, that were built on the outskirts of various municipalities to house Roma and Sinti. And there's a scene in that where a Roma woman who was actually born and raised in Rome, her parents are from Montenegro, she's 19 years old, she goes in to talk to a social worker about getting Italian citizenship. And it's this exchange in which it starts out, this woman, Brenda, she's very enthusiastic. She's like, I'm 19 years old now, I can go in, I can get this. And the social worker starts asking her questions. Are you born in Italy? Yes. Have you had permanent residence in Italy? Yes, for the last 18 years. Are you this? And then it starts, do your parents have a permit of stay? No. Do your parents have a passport? No. How long? And then you can see her kind of deflate until the social worker tells her, well, your only avenue to claim citizenship now is to claim statelessness. And so I heard this a lot when I was doing the field visits in the detention center, because there's really this opacity to all the proceedings, and some of the detainees would hear rumors, oh, it's better to say you're from this place, so they claim that they're from a country that they're not actually from, and then it requires a consular official to come down and verify whether or not they're from a certain country. So say you claim you're from Tunisia, but you're actually from Morocco, and then the Tunisian consular official comes down and says, oh no, this person's not from Tunisia. And there's this whole game of citizenship that's played that goes on and on and on, and there's no definitive end to it. So whereas in prison, where you have a sentence and you serve your sentence and you can know how much time, this is an almost seemingly endless process.
Permanent.
Temporary permanence.
And permanent temporariness.
Yeah.
That's the one I thought.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In your book, which is terrific, as has been pointed out, you also talk about in terms of historical precedents for some of the detention centers, today being the carceral islands under fascism, in which so-called internal enemies were interned, even Gramsci being one of them. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how those relate to contemporary practices, more oppressive, worse to the residents of those carceral islands, in some ways have better lives than what we see in today's Italy.
Well, that's it. That's a good question. And right, the opening essay of the book is called "The Island," and I use it as a metonym. But it starts on Lampedusa, which is the kind of symbol of this crisis of migration and detention. It's this island in the Mediterranean that is closer to Tunisia and Libya than it is to Sicily, its administrative unit. And this is where a lot of arrivals happen of migrants coming from all ends of sub-Saharan Africa, usually funneling through Libya to get to Europe. And in the essay, I show that Lampedusa, while today has one of the most infamous detention centers, it's actually a welcome center, and most of the detainees, it's literally a centro di primo soccorso e accoglienza. Most of the detainees get sent off Lampedusa within a week. No one actually stays there. But shortly after Italian unification in 1861, there was a very draconian law passed in 1863 called the Pica Law, which criminalized any anti-state sentiment. So if you were opposed to the newly unified Italian state, then you could be charged with a crime. And that crime could be jail, sometimes it could be death. And for the most part, the main resistance to Italian unification occurred in the South. And we've read about brigandage, and we've read about a lot of opposition. And it was not, there were a lot of Southerners who were sentenced under the Pica Law that were sent into the newly created institution of domicilio coato, or forced domicile. And these were called coati. These are different from fascist confinati. So this is 1863. And the first boat of coati arrived in Lampedusa in 1864. And they were housed in cameroni, these large rooms, were kind of a bunkhouse, locked in there at night. Today, those cameroni are actually the town hall of Lampedusa. And so that's the late 19th century. In 1911, when Italian troops invaded Libya, one of the strategies for colonization was to create a power vacuum. So there was mass deportations of Bedouin capi notabili, Bedouin aristocrats, for lack of a better word. And these were known as deportati. And they were also sent to Lampedusa, Ustica, Ponza. I should say that the Pica Law established this carceral archipelago in Italy. And then under fascism, those who opposed the regime were also sent into exile, and those were known as confinati, which included Gramsci. Gramsci actually spent 44 days on the island of Ustica, and you can imagine him there with Libyan deportati, with regular coati, and other fascist confinati. So there is this whole history that provide these historical antecedents. Today, I would say in Lampedusa, it was very interesting when I did my field visits there. At the far end of the island, there is actually what's called a LORAN station. Before GPS and satellite navigation, naval ships used to triangulate using these radio stations. And for a long time, it was a NATO station, and then in 1986, after there was the disco bombing in Berlin that was attributed to Gaddafi, the U.S. retaliated, bombed with Scud missiles, bombed Libya, and then Gaddafi apparently was said to have retaliated if the missiles landed off the coast of Lampedusa. But this is what actually, in those news reports, Lampedusa came into the media imaginary, because what people saw was this beautiful, sleepy fishing village, and tourism started to go there. So when, this is in the 1980s, and for the past few decades, tourism started to become a main industry in Lampedusa. So it's this place where you have a mobile class of tourists who are staying in luxury boutique hotels and eating 5-star meals and going to the beach, the Isola dei Conigli, which was rated by TripAdvisor as the most beautiful beach in the world in 2013. And that's running up right against these waves and waves of migrants landing on the shores and being whisked away to the detention center. So one other quick note, in that Lauren station, after Arab Spring, that was repurposed to be a migrant detention center temporarily. Anyway, so,
Yeah, I guess I'd just add, when we were thinking about this international, I don't like the term migrant crisis, because it implies there's a crisis, it's just the fact that they're trying to come in as a crisis. But this migrant flow, and each country receives it based on its own anxieties and its culture. And of course, one of Italy's is the fear of being backward, right? Not being modern enough. And one thing I found doing research for my Empire Cinema book which surprised me, was that the pictures of the camps in Cyrenaica that you saw, not only did the fascists not hide those, but they were proud of them. And they publicized them to the world. They made a Luce, Istituto Luce, which was the state propaganda, film propaganda and photographic. They made a newsreel about it, but it wasn't just a newsreel. It was a newsreel of, they invited the foreign and Italian press, so foreign press, to come and tour this, what you saw with the sad-looking huts, and vaunted it, and Stephanie talked about how it was supposed to be the epitome of discipline, but they vaunted it as an example of their superior organization, including repression, because for authoritarians, the ability to be tough and to repress in a modern fashion was something that nobody thought Italy could do, right? So there's that. So they invited, they invited the foreign press to come and see their repression. And then they also had a coffee table book, which you can see it in the New York Public Library. It's 2 volumes. It's a giant monster. And over 100 pages are spent, glossy, it must have cost a ton. And Mussolini has a preface in it, so it's a big budget thing. And you could have it on your coffee table with 100 pages about the camps and the wall. So for Italy, there was a kind of prestige in being able to, early on. Now it's a little different, because the specter of the migrant is almost like a barbarization. It's going to take us backward. So you have to also look at what state the culture is in with its anxieties to evaluate how they receive the other, right?
And what's interesting, I would also add that in the archival record, the Bedouin tribes are known, they were known as sottomessi. They were subjugated. They were literally called the subjugated populace. And also, to add to what Ruth just said, I found evidence in the archive, reading through the Touring Club Italiano group. They were actually tourists who went to these camps. Yeah.
Oh my God.
And stopped to see this beautiful, idyllic, ordered paradise. So.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And in all of this, the Italian fascists were the pioneers. They were not pioneers of the concentration camp. There was already a genealogy, a colonial one. But the Nazis looked very carefully at what they were doing, because Hitler wasn't even there yet. This was the early 30s, he wasn't there. So that's another part of this. Okay, we have time for one or two more.
So as a sociologist, I'm very curious to know whether it was difficult to get access to these centers and what you had to do to get that access.
Thank you. Yes. The answer is yes. I tried for many years. And, you know, the journalist in me, so part of my background, I worked as a journalist in Italy in the late 90s, and I still have contacts who were there. And so I, you know, was trying to get in there with them. And then I had the very good fortune to have a fellowship at Harvard. And I sent a letter on Harvard letterhead. And 6 months later, the department secretary, I was already in Europe at the time, I had left Harvard. The department secretary calls me and says, "We have a fax for you from the Ministry of Interior saying that you can come on this date in these hours, you and your colleague from the New York Times." And so we went in for 12 hours. And it was at a time, I would say access is granted, it's very hit or miss. Sometimes it's more open, sometimes it's not. It actually depends on who's in charge at the moment. I also discovered a very complex system of governance within the detention center. So the outside of the center is surveilled by the Italian army. It's the responsibility of the Esercito Italiano. Inside, there's kind of a legal part and then a kind of dormitory part, right? So it's kind of a domestic sphere and then like the legal sphere. And the legal sphere is guarded by carabinieri and members of the Questura di Roma, the municipal police. And then on the other side, all of the social services are subcontracted out and they go up for contract every few years. So, you know, the Red Cross had held the contract. When I went in, Auxilium had the contract, and now it's actually a French holding company that has the contract, which is a subsidiary of one of the largest oil companies in the world. So it's a very convoluted thing, but I have to say the reason I got in was because I sent a letter on Harvard letterhead.
Sounds like Trump's camps with which, by the way, if you start delving into the comparative history of camps, even some of Gaddafi's famous prisons and even some Nazi concentration camps that were more mild work camps, people had mattresses and they had access to washrooms, which some of Trump's camp inhabitants, ospiti, they don't have. They sleep on the floor with no mattress. So you can get into interesting comparisons in that way. So one more.
Stephanie, thank you for your wonderful presentation and for your fascinating and deeply productive book. I had a question for you actually with regard to the status of ethnographic collections in Italy and the status of African cultural patrimony housed in Italy in particular. To me, the Ethnographic Museum, which many of which are in sort of a precarious state in Italy, but the Ethnographic Museum seemed to me, as an art historian, to be one site that would fall in line with your model of empire's Mobius Strip, these objects that have either been plundered and taken or received under colonial circumstances, either through missionary acquisitions or through purchase under systems of power. In any case, when we encounter these objects in a museum, they present as things that have circulated, that have been mobile, and typically there's some sort of discussion or brief record, maybe, of how they're acquired or how they were, however awfully, come to be presented in Italy. I guess my question would be twofold. One, to think about how cultural patrimony fits into your theoretical model, particularly given its imbrication with very public presentations of agreements, for example, between Italy and Libya. We have the return of the Venus of Cyrenaica at that moment, and of course itself being a Roman copy of a Greek thing, at the same time that the obelisk of Aksum is returned to Ethiopia. And it seems to be these few cases in which objects have been very spectacularly returned by the Italian government, at the same time the lion's share of African cultural patrimony acquired by Italy under colonial circumstances or missionary expeditions continued to be very much on display in Italy, but in a way that people don't see. You know, these aren't museums that are very much visited, or they're overlooked in urban environments. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit to that and kind of situate that for those of us concerned with sort of collections and material culture as part of this.
That's a great question. And actually, one essay that I cut from the book and I republished elsewhere was on Italian colonial exhibitions. And I think that's where we first get so much of these objects that are then spectacularized and presented, not just for the famous colonial exhibitions like the 1931 exhibition in Paris, but what I wrote about in the other essay was the Tripoli Trade Fair, the Fiera di Tripoli, which was it was inaugurated in 1929 and ran for 1927 and ran to 1939. So it's 12 years. And it's the only colonial exhibition staged on colonial soil that I know about, that I could find. And think of this. So here it's a 50,000 square meter fairgrounds that was created along the Esplanade in Tripoli. I remember that Tripoli too, and I'm citing the work of Mia Fuller. Mia has shown that the entire city of Tripoli was recreated by Italian architects in a kind of Orientalist fantasy of what they believed in a Libyan city or a Mediterranean Orientalist city should look like. So it's always already manipulated. But you have a colonial exhibition that then recreates Africa. They have the Eritrea Pavilion or the Somalia Pavilion, the Rhodes Pavilion, displaying both objects and people, right? These are the classic human zoos that one would see in a colonial exhibition. So a visitor to this exhibition, would one go in and see this kind of fantasy, colonial fantasy of what Italian colonizers wanted the colonies to appear and look like through objects and people, and to assert that cultural patrimony over that fantasy? And then you would step outside into another completely manipulated fantasy. So there's this double enframing of colonial order, which is very different from what happens in the French context or the British context. So there's this, and what I argue in the essay is that weird kind of simulation and simulacrum. I'm looking at where imperialism and simulation run up against each other and what that does. And what I argue in the essay is that it kind of depersonalizes, even to a greater extent, the colonized subject, which allows the opening of the space for the camp to be created.
Well, join me in thanking Stephanie for her wonderful